Well, I'm sure that discussion could go on and on, because there's so much that this psalm invites us to talk about and to discuss. And I think a really important aspect of what we're talking about is the importance of lament, of being able to express properly and carefully our grief or our struggles, our experience of catastrophe. And quite frankly, as British people, we're not very good at doing that. We'd much rather suppress it. I mean, I've never heard intercessions expressed out in this kind of grief and this struggle in a church. They're always kind of polite. If it's all right with you, or there's a little bit of a problem going on at the moment, God, or whatever. But no real struggles, no breaking down, no expression of anger. And of course, it's difficult because it goes against our nature. We kind of withdraw from it. We're embarrassed by it. I mean, if somebody got up and actually said that in a service, most of us would be embarrassed, not sure where to look, because it's so awkward. And yet it's sitting here in the Psalter, inspired by the Holy Spirit. And that we can't write it off. And in some quarters, there's an advocating that you don't read out that last verse. You can read the rest of the psalm, but don't read out that. We take out the awkward bits. But actually, I think it'd be much better, personally, that if we've got a psalm that's got some awkward bits, that we actually say there's some awkward bits in this psalm and I'm going to read them, and just set the context so that we understand where it's coming from rather than ignore them. Otherwise, what we do is we dumb down our faith. And people don't know what to relate. They don't know whether they can relate to what goes on in church. As I've often said, actually, one of the most common liturgies that we find in church services takes place over coffee. And one person is standing in front of another with a cup of coffee, and they go through this vertical response. The first person says, "How are you today?" And the other person says, "Oh, I'm fine, thank you." And then the vertical response has to be the other way around. So the next person, the same person says, "How are you today?" And the other person says, "I'm fine, thank you." Most common liturgy in churches, that we don't actually acknowledge our vulnerabilities and our weaknesses, our brokenness. And yet this psalm is inviting us to go deeper, to express lament, and to actually talk about our troubles. It doesn't necessarily mean you're hanging your dirty laundry out all over the place, but it means that we have to be honest and let people in, so that actually that's where healing can take place. Otherwise, people are not going to come. I remember doing a weekend at Lee Abbey when I was leading Lee Abbey, which was I was speaking at a divorce recovery weekend. People whose lives were broken, their marriages were broken, and they were coming to seek to recover. And there was a communion at the end, and we invited people to come and take communion. But there was one woman who said to one of our pastoral team, I'm so angry at God, I'm not going to take communion. And the pastoral person said, well, just come to the service, but you don't feel that you have to come and take something, but just be with the others that you've been traveling with over this weekend. So they said they would come, but they wouldn't take communion. But just before communion, there was a hymn. And I remember just before I was about to speak, to lead the communion prayer, God spoke to me in the hymn and said, there's something I want you to say, David, straight after the hymn in introduction to the communion. I had no idea about this person in the church with us. And the Lord said this, you need to talk about what's on the table, the brokenness that is on the table. So I paused before I did the communion prayer and I said, I feel it's right to say to you, all our lives are broken and messed up. But what you need to know is there's brokenness on the table. Here on the table, symbolized in this bread and the wine, is somebody who was cheated, who was despised, who was betrayed, who was falsely accused, who was abused, and who was exchanged for another. And he offers his love to you through this bread and wine. And the pastoral team member said, the woman got up and took communion. Because Christ identifies with the broken. And that's why we need to have this within the context of our worship, this sense of lament, acknowledgement of brokenness. It's only there that healing can really take place. So we have to overcome those British sensibilities and try and come to terms with that within our worship. Of course, if you're reading through Paula Gooder's book, Journaling the Psalms, you will come, it's way back further down, you'll come with an opportunity to reflect on that psalm some more. And she asks some good questions about the context in our worship, how we allow such expression within our worship, and what's right and what might not be right. She asks those same questions that I'm asking. The other thing I just want to finish though is draw your attention to Rebecca Solnit, who's an author, who wrote a book called Paradise Built in Hell. And it's a reflection on disasters, catastrophes, and how often our conclusion is when a catastrophe takes place, everything falls apart, anarchy breaks loose, and people just go every person for themselves and they loot and whatever. But she does a study on several catastrophes: the San Francisco earthquake, the Halifax explosion, the Mexico City earthquake, the Twin Towers in New York, and the New Orleans disaster. She's speaking from an American context, but those disasters. And she says, whereas the authorities want to stamp down quickly because they think it's going to go crazy, what happens with the general public is that people rise up and they start soup kitchens and they look out for one another. They heroically take people under their arm and look after them. That's often the people's first response to a catastrophe. So there is goodness in people. That's what she is saying in her book. It's really worth a read. But actually, it helps us to begin to think, we've got questions about why do catastrophes happen? But actually, we've also got questions about how do we respond in the light of catastrophes? There needs to be honest reflection. But there also needs to be the expression of goodness and kindness that reaches out to people. And somehow through that, good can come through all the mess. That's what we're doing in this psalm. We're reflecting on catastrophe and the importance of getting it expressed in some way. And the importance too of actually responding by expressing our own goodness and kindness and care for others. There's much more we can look at in this. I want you to think, perhaps, it's worth thinking some more about what do nations do in response to anger. It's interesting, isn't it? The experience in Gaza, for example, Palestinians expressing their anger at the bombings and so on. And of course, Israelis expressing their anger and grief too at all the hostages that were taken, and actually the terrible cruelties that were implemented when the Hamas moved in and caused such destruction. Our response is try and sit on it quickly and arrest those who are expressing anger or grief. How do we cope with that? How do we cope with the expression, public expression? And sometimes we need to identify with the people on the streets, not causing violence, but to identify, so we understand your grief and your pain here, and stand with people in the midst of that catastrophe. I'm going to leave that for you to discuss. What we should be doing, though, is we should be praying these things through and using psalms like this to help us in our intercessions. So I'm going to leave you to a further discussion and perhaps to round it off with some prayers for what's going on in our world at this present moment. Thanks for joining us today.